Steve Thomas is joining us from the National Medal of Honor Heritage Center in Chattanooga. You may have noticed I've misnamed this museum probably every time I've said it, thanking them every day under a different title. But Steve Thomas is here. He is their Director of Operations. They have a fantastic museum down there. And I can say I first met Steve, this is a true story, in I think Bristol in a bar, and he was wearing a kilt. And so I've always appreciated A, his stylishness, but B, he's also a great appreciator of history, and he does a lot of great work for our veterans, and in particular, the recipients of the Medal of Honor. So I'd like to go ahead and hand over to Steve Thomas. Thank you for coming and joining us, and thank you for your sponsorship.
Warren, I really appreciate you. I get to stand up here and be considered among all of the speakers that you have had so far. The East Tennessee Historical Society is wonderful for you guys to put this on. I want to thank the guys and the gals that are doing the behind-the-scenes work. That's oftentimes the work that I do when we put on events for recipients. Now, if you are not aware of the Medal of Honor, it is the nation's highest award for military valor. Okay, the Navy was actually the very first branch to be authorized to issue the Medal of Honor in 1861. The Army soon thereafter said they can't have something we don't have, so we want ours. So right after the Navy is introducing their Medal of Honor, the Army is rolling out their version as well. Now, when it is rolled out, it is a very tumultuous time in our country. And oftentimes people forget the actual reasoning behind the Medal of Honor. Now, it's created with the idea of destroying secession. Right? That is what is at the biggest discord in our country at that time. I don't have an image of the 19th century medal, but when we get to the Navy Medal of Honor, which the modern Navy Medal of Honor is, they still use the original 19th century design, right? The symbolism in the medal is still there, steeped in tradition. But the Charles H. Coolidge National Medal of Honor Heritage Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, we work to preserve the stories of Medal of Honor recipients. And along with that, you also have the values that are considered part of the Medal of Honor and recipients that show these values in their actions. Now, what you'll notice there is these 6 values are not unique to any one single group of people on the earth. We all show these values in certain ways, but what's interesting to me is if you look at it through a lens of service, it starts to look a little bit different because all of these words are action words and they all boil back down to love of something, right? It's something that you love that's bigger and is more important than you. Okay, that's what the Medal of Honor represents. Now, you'll see the 3 different versions, the 3 branches, the medals here. Make sure I don't mess this up. Anyway, on the Navy Medal of Honor, you can see the original design. You'll see Minerva. She is the goddess of war. She has an owl on her head, which represents the wisdom. She is carrying a shield with the American coat of arms on it, and she's expelling discord from the nation. Discord is represented as a man with snakes in his hands. Now, these snakes are going to represent secession itself. The idea of breaking apart our union goes against the very fabric of the values of our country because we're working to build a more perfect union. The idea of breaking it apart is sacrilegious. Now, that is what the Medal of Honor was originally created. Now, over time, it starts to take on different meanings and looks. Now, when I was a child, my mom worked at the Alvin C. York VA in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. She was there for 36 years. Now, I remember as a young child, the very first time I was introduced to this thing called the Medal of Honor was through the lens of Alvin York. Most Tennesseans know Alvin and his story, but most don't realize what he did after the war. And that is something that inspired me to continue learning more about the individual. Because if you just read their citation, you are reading about the worst day of their lives. How did they get to that point? What did they do after? Now, for York, leading up, being a pacifist before the war, conscientious objector, being convinced by his cadre of trainers in his basic training that God was on our side to go and fight the Germans, he reluctantly chose to fight and pick up a rifle. Now, during his patrol, 16 other men took part in his patrol, but nobody ever really talks about them. There were actually other citations, Medal of Honor citations from that patrol that were swept under the rug by General Lindsay as he tried to gain more favor and build his reputation in Europe. But in 1917, there was a committee formed that are going to perform what is known as the Great Purge in Medal of Honor history. Up until 1917, it had been seen as just something you give soldiers. And in fact, there was a company commander that had a friend at the War Department. In the 1880s, he recommended his entire company for the Medal of Honor, and they received it, every single man. So they started going through and putting standards to what is valor, okay? And in doing so, they purged 1,000 medals off the record, and eventually one is going to be reinstated. But that is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, the first and only female currently to have received the Medal of Honor for her actions during the Civil War. Now, once they start adding these stipulations and different standards to valor, you start to see the number of recipients from each conflict drop, right? Because it goes through a very strenuous process. Now, and for World War II, you have 473 Medal of Honor recipients. We're going to focus on 3 of them today that called Tennessee home. One of which we derive our namesake at the center, Charles Coolidge, who is originally from Signal Mountain. Paul Huff, who is originally from Cleveland, Tennessee, just right up the road from Chattanooga. And then Alexander Bonnyman, Jr., who is a native Knoxvillian. Okay? All 3 of these men have different varying degrees of service, right? And that's the way we should be looking at the Medal of Honor, not necessarily through the eyes of heroics, but through the eyes of service. Okay, so keep that in mind, because I oftentimes believe and hope that by the end of my talk, you will see that these recipients are the best representations of their communities. It's not necessarily them. It's the values that they carry with them throughout their lives. Right? Now, we're going to start with Charles Coolidge. Now, he's born in Signal Mountain in August of 1921. Small family, but he did grow up watching his mom run the house. Okay? His father owned a printing press in Chattanooga, and he would be gone before the sun was even up. And Charles's parents were adamant that education was very, very important. So they did not make him work during his school time, but during the summer months, he would oftentimes help at the printing press. But you can see he was an avid fan of baseball. He played baseball all through high school at Chattanooga High. He graduates in 1939. Now, after he graduates, he immediately starts working with his dad at Chattanooga Printing, where he's learning the trade of running a printing business. Now, after Pearl Harbor, he is going to be drafted. He is sent to the 36th Infantry Division, which is a Texas National Guard unit. Again, Texas needing Tennesseans to run things properly. But with the old the Indian Head Division of Texas, he is going to go on a wild ride in his time in the war, because the 36th Infantry Division actually boasts the longest time on the front lines during the war, over 400 days. Right now, you can see that he was part of a heavy weapons platoon. He is in charge of deploying 30 caliber machine guns, and also at some points throughout his time in Europe, he would also be in control of mortar teams as well. He goes all the way through North Africa. He makes the invasion of Italy. He's a part of the invasion of southern France, and he also takes part in the Battle of Siegfried Line. You can see that he walked more than 1,200 miles as an infantryman on 2 separate continents while fighting the enemy. That's a long way. I don't know how many of you have ever worn a pair of World War II GI boots. Not the most comfortable thing to march around in. Also, they wear out pretty quickly. In fact, Charles said the quickest he wore out a pair of boots was in Italy, but the weather had not been so great. He wore out a pair of Army combat boots in about a month. That's wild, right? But his action takes place in France on the border, on the German border in October of 1944. Now, as the 36th are advancing east, they sent the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which is the all Japanese American unit that was attached to the 36th Division. They were doing some recon because they were trying to find some soft spots. Well, unfortunately, the 442 had gotten surrounded on a nearby hill. Coolidge actually volunteered, and it says ordered on here, but I've actually found the original morning reports finally, and it actually says that he volunteered. So I've got to change that. But volunteering his recon, he actually goes ahead and starts laying the field telephone wire as well. As he is going up, the whole plan is he needs to occupy a certain amount of space so he can draw some of the Germans off of the 442. That way they can slip out. Now, as he's making his recon up this pathway towards Hill 623, he overheard Germans down the hill. He peeked over the small cliff that was there, and he saw about 12 men standing in black uniforms. He immediately assumed that they were SS, right? The SS were not very nice to our soldiers, so in turn, our soldiers were not very nice to them. Charles Coolidge oftentimes talked about how his favorite weapon during the war was the grenade. It's the most effective weapon that you can have in close combat. But on top of a hill, he decides to pull the pin on 7 of those grenades and just drop them on top of the Germans. Now, the explosions of the grenade, the Germans screaming, that is what draws the attention to Coolidge. So as he is moving into position, he has an entire platoon of fresh replacements. These guys have only been in Europe for 2 weeks, and now he is going to mount a 4-day defense against an overwhelming German force. Okay? Now, while he is there, they immediately get online. They're setting up their defense. And about 5 hours after getting there, he sees a German patrol coming up the hill. He holds fire and he walks out to speak to the Germans. Because he developed something early on that I think shows the kind of man that he is. He oftentimes said that if I could get my men out of a firefight by asking the Germans to surrender, I'm going to. And he started doing that in Italy. Now, it wasn't always successful, but he walks out to this small German patrol with with his assistant platoon leader, and he asks the Germans straight up, do you want to surrender? And they're looking at him as the assistant platoon leader is translating into German for them. And then a firefight breaks out because the Germans didn't take too kindly to it. Now, they get back to their line. So for the next 2 days, you have 3 days, you have back and forth attacks and counterattacks. Okay, but Coolidge's main mission is to just draw the attention away from the other unit, the 442. He's worried that it's not working because he's already been there for 3 days and it's not seeming to break. But on October 27th, he had 2 German tanks roll up to his position. Now, The first tank that rolled up, the hatch was already open. And the German tank commander was very arrogant, and he was already out of the hatch, rolling up to the position. When he gets to the position, he calls for the Americans in perfect English, "Send out your leader." Coolidge steps out. He's about 20 yards from the barrel of this tank. And the German commander had heard what he had done earlier by asking for the German forces to surrender. Now it's his turn. "American, are you ready to surrender?" And that is where a little piece of that East Tennessee attitude comes in. He said, "Sorry, Mac, you're going to have to come get me." Turns around, darts back into the woods to get back to his line. At that moment, that tank emptied 5 rounds, point blank, into their position. And so for the next 2 days, he is having to contend with these German tanks. But that's perfect, because the German tactic has always been infantry-supported armor, right? So as long as he knew that the Germans were behind the tanks, he can get around the tank. So he started using grenades. From his positions and his men's, they started pulling pins and lobbing them over the grenades. They inflicted so many casualties just by doing that. Now, at one point, on the final day that he was in his position, he grabbed the bazooka and ran out to take aim at the tank. He had already done all the necessary lead up to get the bazooka ready, but the one thing he didn't do was check to see if there were batteries. Now, during World War II, the field radios and the bazookas both operated on the same battery. It's just a D-cell battery, basically. But because he is now out in the open, he has a bazooka that's not going to fire and a tank that's rolling up to him. It was about that time that his assistant platoon leader, George, who is from Long Island, actually was able to come out, throw grenades at the tank or smoke grenades at the tank to give him cover to get back. Now, Charles always said that George deserved a Medal of Honor for that. George never got recognized, but we now know George's name. So now you get to tell that story as well. Now, for Coolidge, he slipped out on the fifth night, the fourth night leading into the 5th day. As he is slipping out, he realizes that the 442 had been relieved on the 3rd day. The 3rd day, he stayed there an extra day and a half just to make sure that they were good. There's nothing like the hard-headedness of East Tennesseans, right? Like we've dug in tighter than a tick. You can't get us out, right? Now, after his action, he continues to fight. He's leading his men, and it's not until March of 1945, that he is going to be recognized, which is actually pretty quick, considering. But General Haslip had to actually take a Piper Cub to where they were located in Dortstadt, Germany. They were so far ahead of the lines that this general had to get into the Piper Cub and fly out there. And they held the ceremony at that bombed out airfield in Dortstadt. Now, this is what's really interesting. During World War II, these recipients, they were given the option to either have their ceremony in the field and in D.C., or they could have it just in D.C. The majority of them chose to just have it in D.C. There's a few guys that actually decided, you know what, I think my men deserve to see this ceremony because it's because of them that I'm even here anyway. So Charles Coolidge holds his ceremony in theater, but he never has a ceremony in D.C. He comes back. He believes he's going to be sent on the war bond tour, and you can see this picture right here is right after he had landed at Camp Atterbury, and you just can see the exhaustion on his face. And the certificate, sorry. Now, he immediately gets married to Frances. Now, Frances actually is able to inform us a little bit more about who Charles is. The years following World War II, he didn't really talk too much about his service, but he became very involved in veteran organizations around Chattanooga. He would organize events. He understood the history of Chattanooga as the birthplace of the Medal of Honor. During the Civil War, the first 52 actions that took place within a 25-mile radius of downtown Chattanooga. He grew up knowing about these men and one woman, Mary Walker. Now, for Charles, the community is what was most important. He understood, just like he did in the service, you got to take care of your men. That's what makes a unit cohesive. That's what makes a unit productive. It's about taking care of each other, right? And what's really cool is that this medal actually gave him a chance to meet a very good friend of his, or would become a good friend of his, Paul Huff. You can see Paul Huff right here. Paul had already gotten married by this point. His wife, Betty, is standing next to him. Betty is still living. She is 101. Stopped driving when she was 99. Stopped mowing the yard when she was 100. She is a pistol. Now, if you know Paul, you would have to understand that's how Betty had to be. Now, not much is known about Paul's early life. But again, we can see that the community is what brought him up, and the values that he learned very early on in his life come into play. He's born in Cleveland, Tennessee. He enlists at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and he will join the 509th Parachute Regiment, which is an independent regiment at the time. It's still kind of testing in the test phases at that point, but it's considered dangerous. Again, that's why they gave that extra $50 a month jump pay, because it was hazardous, right? You could die. But he is no stranger to that kind of courage. That's that personal courage of being able to overcome that fear. And you can see he fought in several campaigns, and bringing up Anzio is actually where he's going to receive, or that's where his action takes place to receive his Medal of Honor. Happens in February of 1944. He volunteers to lead a patrol. The patrol is a 6-man patrol. At Anzio, they're actually being bombarded, right? They're taking fire, and he is volunteering to find out where it's coming from. So as he's leading this patrol, they are being shot at by small arms fire the entire time. He comes up to a minefield. He halts his patrol. He traverses the minefield by himself, and he eliminates one German machine gun with a grenade. And at that time, as soon as he eliminates that one, a second and a third open up on him. Now, at this point, he doesn't think that he can take out the next two by himself. So he goes back through that minefield. He tells the patrol to bring up the balance of the platoon, because he thinks he's able to rout these Germans out, because he doesn't think they're a superior force. So the balance of the platoon comes up, and the platoon sergeant and the platoon leader don't even lead from there on. They rely on Paul. So Paul then leads them through that minefield again, and they are able to dismantle and destroy those German machine gun emplacements pretty quickly. Now, same thing with Coolidge. He decides that he wants to have his ceremony in theater. He has his ceremony in southern France after jumping into Operation Dragoon. You can see the image there with Mark Clark soon after the medal is put around his neck. He is immediately brought home for the War Bond Tour, because he is now the very first American paratrooper to have received the Medal of Honor. And that's a big distinction. And so in order to help the population understand what paratroopers do, the Army put on the Army Aerial Show, where they would travel around the country and do different aerial demonstrations, whether that's through aircraft or, like in Paul's case, do demonstration jumps of how paratroopers are deployed into combat. And you can see that picture right there in the middle. That is moments after Paul proposed to Betty. He proposed to her as he was getting on the plane to do a demonstration jump in California. Pretty cool. Yeah. But what's really cool about Paul, and it was what's different than Coolidge, is that his time, his service was going to continue, whereas Coolidge's military service ended. He just started a different kind of service to his community. Paul stays in. He has an amazing career in the United States Army. You can see this first picture on the left. You'll see this is in 1958. 58. That is President Eisenhower. Paul Huff is the representative, the Medal of Honor representative, bestowing the Medal of Honor to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for World War II. It's pretty cool. Tennessee Medal of Honor recipient. World War I Medal of Honor recipient that was going to represent Alvin York. It's pretty cool. And that right there was the beginning of a wonderful friendship too. Huff and Alvin York became very close friends. But for Paul Huff, once Korea kicked off, he was not allowed to go. He was just serving in Washington. But by the time we get to Vietnam, he is now the command sergeant major of the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell. The 101st is about to be deployed to Vietnam. And he knows that they're going to try to keep him from going. So he volunteers. He goes to D.C. He still has friends in D.C. from when he was fighting in World War II that remember him, such as Bradley. So he contacts his old connections, and he asks, please let me go do one more tour duty in a combat zone. They reluctantly said yes, but they put two stipulations on him. One, he had to retire immediately after returning after his tour of duty. The second one, he was not allowed to go beyond the wire once he was in Vietnam. I don't know how many command sergeant majors you know. They're not the type to say, yeah, you guys go ahead, I'll stay here. If you think that he stayed behind the wire while his men went out on patrol, please stand on your head now. We don't have any evidence to show that he did, but it is very likely that he did. Because he was a wild man, right? He was tough. Now, Huff will retire after he does his tour of duty in Vietnam. He goes home to Clarksville. He retires in Clarksville. He moves back to Cleveland, Tennessee in the late 80s. And then he is going to pass away quietly in 1994. Now, for that small amount of time that he is living in Cleveland, he plugs himself into the veteran community. By this point, Chattanooga its veteran community continues to grow. And even today, we have the second largest VVA chapter, the Vietnam Veterans Association chapter in the country, VVA 203. So that veteran community can draw its lineage right back to these men and the work that they did laying that groundwork, getting the community, the civilian community population involved with the veteran population as well. So for Coolidge and for Huff, the different lessons and values that they had brought from their communities, Coolidge as a kid was very resourceful. He looked to take care of people all the time. When he was a captain on his baseball team, he would help coach. He would help lead his players when they would play games. But it's about that he understood that there is a sense of or a need to take care of someone. For Huff, he also has that same feeling, but the toughness that comes out of him from the Cleveland community and that commitment is what comes from him. But then we move on to Alexander Bonnyman, who, by all accounts, is probably one of my favorite Medal of Honor stories. He's a native Knoxvillian. Sandy, it's referring to his hair. He was a blonde man. He was a gorgeous man, right? He's definitely the ideal Hollywood type architect, and I'll get to that here in a moment. You'll see a better photo of him. But he grew up in Knoxville. His father owned a coal mining operation in Kentucky, and in fact, lived a pretty privileged life, pretty wealthy. He went to Princeton, where he dropped out. He then decides, you know what? I want to be my own man. He moves out to New Mexico, where he is going to purchase a copper mining operation. So now, as we get closer to the war effort, he's actually exempt from military service because his father's industry and his industry are in the war effort. But he, at the age of 31, decides, you know what, I'm going to enlist in the Marine Corps anyway. Who's in their 30s here? You think you'd be able to do Marine Corps boot camp right now? No. So for a man in his 30s who's also quite wealthy, the fact that he enlisted also shows a lot about who he is. He doesn't want to be considered part of the officer class. So you can see this photograph right here of him after he graduates Marine Corps boot camp in San Diego, 1942. Now, he is attached to the 2nd Marine Division, where he is going to participate in the invasion of Guadalcanal. Now, for what you know about Guadalcanal is some tough fighting. You have a bit of attrition rate for the Americans where officers are being killed. You have field promotions taking place all the time. Well, Sandy was one of these cases. Because of his age and experience, he is going to go through his time at Guadalcanal, and then he is going to be commissioned a 2nd lieutenant. Which all of this is going to lead up to when his action takes place in November of 1943 at the Battle of Tarawa. Now, at the Battle of Tarawa, his landing beach is Red Beach number 3. He is the shore party officer. Now, for a shore party officer, his responsibility is to bring ashore the equipment. And they chose his beach specifically because there was defilade. There was a sand dune that gave him plenty of cover to get all of the machinery and equipment ashore that he needed to. I love this photo that you see right here because Bonnyman is actually in this photo. He's right down there. And you'll notice that he is the only Marine not wearing a helmet cover. And it's because you can see those 3 stripes on his helmet. Those 3 stripes represent the beach that he was landing on, because previously at other islands, once they were invaded, you had so much confusion that you had shore party officers being pulled to be pushed into somewhere else, and now you have no one controlling the equipment coming ashore. So they made it very specific that if you see an officer with this painted on their helmet, or a 2-inch white stripe painted around their right thigh between their knee and their hip, you are not to bother them. They are responsible for something else. Unfortunately, that defilade that he is the reason they chose his landing beach was the Japanese headquarters bunker. Aerial reconnaissance didn't pick up that. So you have Marines on the other side of the island getting stuck 500 yards out in the lagoon, having to wade ashore, being raped, and they can't do anything because of this bunker. So throughout the next couple of days of this invasion, there's another better picture of the bunker. You have Bonnyman trying to devise a plan, even though he's being told to sit tight. Tennesseans don't like waiting. If we see a problem and we think we can fix it, we're going to try. Now, for Bonnyman, the way he was planning on doing this is he noticed the ventilation shafts on top of the bunker. He was going to throw a satchel charge into the bunker while simultaneously the flamethrowers are sticking their wands into the ventilation shafts. Unfortunately, that's not how it's going to go. Now, we're very thankful that we have these photographs of Bonnyman at Tarawa. He's actually the very first Medal of Honor recipient to have his action recorded on film. Documentarian Norm Hatch was embedded with Bonnyman's unit because, again, it was planned that that landing beach was going to be safe. So Norm Hatch is making a documentary about the invasion of Tarawa, and he is capturing something quite unique. He is capturing Bonnyman organizing his men during his action. Now, you don't see his death, but you do get to see him lead his men confidently as they try to eliminate this bunker. And I actually have it for you right here.
This bunker is giving us plenty of trouble. We have orders to clean it out.
The testimony is that he saw Bonnyman ordering the flamethrowers up on top of the bunker as he was giving them cover from top of the bunker. Now, unfortunately, the first blast from a flamethrower forced all the Japanese from that bunker out. And so now he has a massive amount of Japanese soldiers running at him, and it's him armed with an M1 carbine and 2 flamethrower operators. Both flamethrowers are eliminated. Both men are killed. It's now Bonnyman standing on top of this bunker, taking out the Japanese as they are running towards him. The eyewitness said that he had a cigar in his mouth and he was yelling orders as the smoke billowed around him. Now, he is stuck in a very hard place. How many Marines we got in here? Marines are known for their accuracy. They're known for their good shot. But he also knows that in the state of combat, shots aren't going to be super accurate. And he has now found himself stuck in between the Japanese and his own Marines. So it's him. So the eyewitness says that he saw him run down the other side of the bunker, but continued to hear rifle fire. By the time the Marines caught up to Bonnyman's position, he was laying, after being mortally wounded, with 25 dead Japanese soldiers all around him. Now, story doesn't end there, because the Graves registration team, their whole responsibility is to come in after a battle, collect the remains, bury them in mass graves until the entire area is secured, to come in and then do proper burials or proper registration of the remains. Unfortunately, the mass grave that Bonnyman was in, coordinates were lost. They would not be found until 2010. Now, the way they were able to identify his remains were through dental records, but it's not how you would think. In 1942, when he is enlisting in the Marine Corps, the dental records show that he had 6 gold-capped teeth in his head. Not many enlisted Marines would be able to afford that much gold in dental work, right? That was the very first set of remains. They didn't know that he was in a mass grave. They just thought that he had been buried, but he still was able to lead this archaeological team to the men that he fought with, even from beyond. Now, the legacy of Bonnyman is carried on through a book which I highly recommend to all of you. It's called Bones of My Grandfather. Clay Bonnyman Evans is the grandson of Alexander Bonnyman Jr., and he is the gentleman that was actually on the team with the honor flight that found his grandfather's remains. In the book, he talks about the ripple effect, because we see the heroics. Unfortunately, sometimes we glorify them too much because we don't think about what happens after. So after the war, Bonnyman had married Jo, his wife, in the 30s, and they actually had 3 daughters together, all of which were old enough to remember their father before going to war. And now he's not coming home. So Jo, obviously, is distraught. Eventually, she remarries. The gentleman that she remarries is abusive. He's an alcoholic. And he beat and abused Bonnyman's 3 daughters and Jo. And Clay oftentimes talks about how selfish it was of his grandfather. But he understands. So there's this duality, right? Upset that you made a selfish decision in combat, but also the fact that if you didn't do that, so many more men would have died. That shows me that Knoxvillians know how to make tough decisions. That's a value that he carried with him. Now, for Bonnyman, he is remembered at the Heritage Center in many different ways. But one of the ways is when I'm giving tours. My goal when I give tours to people at the center, yes, we're going to talk about the stories. We're going to work to preserve the legacies and the stories of Medal of Honor recipients. But I want you to get a human look at them. Because far too often our country focuses so much on the hero aspect that we lose sight of the humanity of it. Because, this is the greatest generation. I don't think it's the courage that made them great. I think it's the devotion to others that made them great. Maybe that's the lesson from the greatest generation. So you now have your orders. Take care of your men. See them through. Thank you all very much. And thank you. Happy to take questions. I don't know how much time what time is it? Just a few minutes.
Is there any way you can put your very first slide back up there?
Absolutely, I can.
I have a selfish reason for that.
Why is that?
Well, that is the backyard of the house where my wife grew up. Well, I'm familiar with the house back there, and that stonework
Oh, wait.
is the only stonework that I know of on Signal Mountain.
That one right there?
Yep, that's it. That's the house behind their house. And she and her brother played baseball on that. And that's the stonework of their house.
That's pretty cool.
So do you know what the address was?
I do have the address. I don't know it off the top of my head.
Look up 607 Mississippi Avenue and see if
I'm gonna make a note of that.
Absolutely amazing.
606.
Small world.
That is a small
It's a
one.
small world. Okay.
Very nice.
I'd love to know. So,
I will look it up here in a moment, and
Okay.
we'll let you know.
all right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, how many or how few are there living Medal of Honor recipients?
There are 63 living currently. The most recent one to pass away was Captain Larry Taylor, who is a Chattanoogan, Vietnam era recipient. If you haven't read his story, check it out. He was a Cobra helicopter pilot. He's the most decorated Army aviation pilot of the war. After only 11 months in combat, he racked up 58 combat awards. He actually saved a team of 4 men with his Cobra helicopter, which is not a passenger helicopter. It's only this wide. But he was able to get 4 men or 2 men to straddle the rocket pods and 2 men to hold on to the skids to get them away from 200 NVA regulars that were about to overrun them. Check them out. Yeah. Any other? Yes, sir.
I did a little bit of research on Paul Huff, and it was my understanding that his Medal of Honor was actually it was donated to the Tomb of the Unknown. Was that?
No, his medal is actually in Cleveland.
Okay.
I can't remember the name of that little site. It's a small little site that they have for. I'll look it up. I'll get back with you on that one. I can't remember the name, but yeah, no, his medal was not the one that was donated to the tomb.
Okay.
No.
Like I said, I did a little bit, I was doing some research on him, and I thought that they said that.
Yeah.
I was going,
Well, and I think it was assumed because of that picture. You can't see him wearing the ribbon.
right.
Let me get to it. Yeah, you can't really tell, but he is wearing the medal around his neck.
Okay.
But
But
he's holding a pillow with another
Right,
medal.
okay.
Yeah. Yep, yeah. Yes, sir.
Why did Bonnyman run away from his troops on the top of that bunker? They're on this side, flamethrowers, guns, and I guess he goes down the other side, firing away?
It all goes back to standard operating procedure. If you are going to take a fortification, you can't take just one side of it. You have to take the whole thing. And I think he recognized that. I just don't think that he had the patience to wait to organize it necessarily, because he didn't really know the force of Japanese that were running out at him. So what he was trying to do was trying to divert them back down to the other side, so that would give his Marines time to get up on top. I think that we can't know for certain, but that is what I think he was working to do, is because as he was running to the corner of the bunker, the witnesses say that he was waving them up to the top.
So he was diverting the Japs to follow him.
Correct.
To be hit maybe in the side.
From the side or the back.
Especially by the guys on the hiding on
Correct.
this side of the hill.
That's correct.
Well, pardon me, but part of the things at Tarawa is that the Marines and Navy learned that naval gunfire can't be directed at the bunker on its sides. That's where they're the strongest. So all during Tarawa, they were firing at the bunkers on the sides, and it wasn't making any impact, or wasn't making any difference. The Marines didn't know that until they got ashore. It just made the whole thing pockmarked, so it made it difficult to get to the bunkers. The tops are the most vulnerable part of the fortification, so you had to get on the top and over to the next.
And that's what Bonnyman was doing.
Yes, sir.
Where are the remains of Alexander Bonnyman buried?
It's at a
Knoxville, what cemetery? Yeah,
Highland, yes.
Island Cemetery.
Yeah, he's with the family. He's in the family plot that's there. His remains were found in 2010, along with 25 other Marines in that mass grave. They have, from what I understand, have now all been identified and all have been repatriated and have been buried in their respective homes. So yeah, it's you can go right out to the Highland Cemetery and see Bonnyman's gravesite today.
What happened to the copper mine?
The copper mine was actually sold by Joe, and she used that money to send her daughters away from her new husband. She got them as far away as possible. And again, like if you read Bonnyman's book, Clay's book, he's a trained journalist. He is a wonderful writer. But he paints this wonderful picture of growing up, knowing who this man is, but they don't talk about him as the black sheep like he was. I mean, his brother, George, Alexander Bonnyman's brother, George, by all accounts, would be considered the picture-perfect soldier. But Bonnyman, or Alex, he's the black sheep. He's the wild card. And that's oftentimes what I have found in studying recipients. And in fact, a Global War on Terror recipient who has said, I can quote him, but I cannot say his name because he has an image to uphold. He said, we were all shitheads. Because think about it, you can't make these kinds of decisions without some kind of life experience, right? For people that are sheltered their entire lives, being able to make a life or death decision, they don't know how to do that. It's those guys that have done things, that have made bad choices, that have learned to live with those choices and been able to move forward. Those are the men that are able to actually make change happen, right? One more? Go ahead.
For the Paul Huff Medal of Honor, could it be at the museum center at 5 points?
5 points. That's where it's at. Thank you, sir.
He's from Cleveland.
Aha! Yay. Very nice. Very nice.
Thank you.
Whose point? Oh, yes, sir.
I think I had heard that Sandy Bonneman at one point was also active with the OSS. Is that accurate?
Not accurate. He was not part of the OSS. He had been approached, but the reason they wanted him was because he looked Hollywood, and they felt that they could use that to their advantage. But he never actually worked with them because he's like, I've got men to lead. I'm not doing that. So he was a wild card, and it's kind of surprising that he turned down the OSS. But I think it's because he enjoyed the camaraderie of his Marines more. So, thank you all so very, very much. Thank you.
So if everyone could take their seats, I always like to, and this is maybe not a great idea, but I always like to end a conference. When I first started having conferences, the first one I organized was in Nottingham in about 2010, I think. I always like to have a sort of final session that's real brief, where we sort of make sure it's been a successful conference and we kind of just sort of talk about things and go over things. So when I started, I listed a few of the objectives that I had for the conference. And a few of them I think that I think I can knock off the list. The first was we were commemorating D-Day, and I feel like that's been very successful. We were commemorating the anniversary of Churchill's birth 150 years ago, which I feel like was successful. We were celebrating the birth of my father 70 years ago, which I feel like has been successful. But there are a few other things, and I want to just sort of go with Richard this. One of the most important things for me was a knowledge exchange between us and our British colleagues. Obviously, Alan isn't here to discuss, but I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that, Richard, and how you feel the conference has gone, and what are the big things, the big takeaways we can think about.
Well, I think there's lots of things to say. I suppose the first thing I'd really like to say is that we've consistently thanked all the different societies who've sponsored and supported the conference, and we've thanked the organisers, for which we're very grateful. But I think we should also thank the audience, because a lot of people have come up to me and made sort of kind and generous comments, and I thought you were very appreciative audience, and I want you to know that we appreciate your appreciation. So
and give yourself a round of applause.
So that's important. In terms of the knowledge exchange, of course, I've learned an enormous amount about Tennessee and Knoxville, and learnt about the different institutions which you have here in the state, and very impressive range of different organisations and speakers who you've been able to bring in, certainly to tell me about many things I didn't know. I mean, it's kind of invidious to sort of pick out any individual speaker, I suppose, but just because not everybody was there at dinner last night, people didn't hear the sort of post-perennial. I was very impressed by Kelly McGill's presentation on her forthcoming documentary, Manoeuvres, War Games in the Heartland, and we were discussing afterwards that you'd obviously lived here a great part of your life and not known really about these war games that took place in 1941, 1943 here in the States, and indeed it's an absolutely extraordinary story. So I won't just recapitulate everything that I've learned because that would take another 2 days. I suppose what I think is, I think it's great that you've been able to get 100 or so people out here in busy time to spend a lot of time talking about history. I just sort of goes back to something which Mike said at the beginning of the morning about how he wants his students, he doesn't want to tell them what to think, but rather wants to sort of give them the themes to think about, and to that I would add the sort of techniques or skills for thinking about things as well. And I just think it's important that this kind of activity continues, because when so much discussion of public events kind of goes online, that's great in its place, but it does lead to sometimes conversations becoming sort of more adversarial, if you like, and hostile. And I think that a way to counter that is to actually bring people together in person and get them face to face, and people will think twice about saying things to people's faces which they don't seem to think for a second about sort of saying online. So I think the more that we can get people together to discuss whether it's history or politics or whatever matter of concern it is, I think that's a very good thing to do in and itself, whether the topic is D-Day or Churchill or the history of Tennessee or whatever it might be. So I would only commend you. It's quite clear, the first time I came to Knoxville was at the conference which Mike mentioned earlier back in 2006, and it's clear that has lived on in the memory of the community. Hopefully this conference will live on too, and I will only say I hope this will be, it's obviously not the first because it is one of a series, but with a series, so the start of the series going back, as he said, 18 years. So let us hope it is sort of a staging post in a continuing series of conferences where we can all get together and continue to discuss these matters.
Thank you, Richard. And I can also say this is the first one of these conferences that we've done and hosted at the Society, and I think it's been extraordinarily successful. And again, I can't thank Ken, Kelly, and Gay enough, as well as the rest of the staff. Rebecca, who again placed all of the things around the room. She isn't in the room at the moment. And one of the things I think that's been really important for me is to showcase East Tennessee history. And I'll share this with you. Our friend Barry, who was originally invited to the conference, Barry Phipps, and unfortunately he couldn't come because he had a other engagement in Japan. But he asked me when I took the position that I took here, he said, "Warren, that just sounds like some sort of reenactment society. Why would you go back to East Tennessee?" And I said, "Well, it's my home and I love it." And he to this day, I don't know that he fully understands everything that we do. But one of the things that was important for me, and is important, I think, that we do at the East Tennessee Historical Society, is to showcase that East Tennessee history is global history. And there are so many things we've talked about today, going from the TVA. That project starts here. That's a national level thing. That's an East Tennessee thing. That's national history. The parks, we mentioned those briefly. You can go see and learn about that in the museum, the founding of the Smoky Mountain National Parks. But then, of course, Oak Ridge. And Oak Ridge, even today when Stephen Fritz was talking about it, it's remarkable. This changed the outcome of the war. Without the atomic weapons, the outcome of the war could have been, there might have been a separate peace made. There's all sorts of variables that we'll never know, and I'm not going to sit up here and play what if, but Oak Ridge, East Tennessee, changed the course of human history forever. And so I always like to say East Tennessee history is global history. history. This is a part of who we are. We changed the world here. And I think that's important to take note of and to commemorate and to be proud of. And as an East Tennessean, whether I'm in Cambridge or Aberystwyth or Japan or the other places I've visited, I like to think that we're out there being ambassadors for East Tennessee and changing the world. So I really love that. And I can say, I mean, I hope that this is the beginning of a tradition for East Tennessee where we host these types of conferences more and more. We'll do other partnerships with the Howard Baker Center. I mean, we'll continue to grow this because I think we've had such a positive response from the community and from the historical community and the academic community. So I'm really, really excited to see where the future of history takes us. So I just want to thank everybody for coming out. I'm probably going to release you all now to have lunch downtown in beautiful Knoxville, and to remind you, if you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, you should become a member. Also, there's a gift shop. So thank you very much. Yes, ma'am. Are there any questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I should.
I have done Dover and I've done Normandy, but in your follow-up material, if there are resources about groups or travel, I would love to have an opportunity to go on another trip that would follow my father and General Patton and the 7th Armored Division all the way to the Baltic. If there's anything.
Let me second that. Let
Okay.
me second that.
I'll
I
do
think
it.
that's a great idea.
I've done it many times, and we're doing it again soon, so.
Well, maybe we have an email list, thanks in part to Kelly, where we could maybe sort of help organize, at least help convene, put people together with you for the next trip that you take.
Like some of the Vander Brothers tours that you see commercially, we tailor each tour that we do to Europe to whoever's with us. There was a family that had a relative die in Operation Market Garden, and we were able to go to the canal where he was killed and those kind of things. So we actually tailor it, to where your relatives were.
There's a
or whatever.
memorial
It's not
for
a,
7th Armored Division,
Yeah,
some
right.
of those things that
we
aren't
do the
known.
research ahead of time and take you there.
If there's some way of communicating and sharing some of that information, I think.
And we focus on Tennessee when we're there.
We have a regular. Are you a member? You're a member, I
Yes,
think.
yes.
Well, we have a regular email, and we can sort of, like I say, we can kind of try to put everyone together
While we're
and
still
have
young enough.
yeah, of course. Yes, ma'am.
Will the videos that you took be available for people to watch?
Yes, they will. So the plan is with Community TV, they will air it. They're going to be sort of producing it and so forth. They'll air it, and then we'll put it up on YouTube. And so we will make it available, and as they come, it'll take time, of course, but as they come out, we'll put those on our YouTube channel and
Put that in your newsletter when they're available.
yes, we will. Thank you. That's a great idea. Yes, sir,
I've
Dr.
got
Frisbee.
one more question, and I don't want to make it long, but I've got a Churchill question, and both of you could address that a little bit. I know it's close to lunch, I don't want to make anybody queasy, but when I teach Russian geography, the first slide I put up on the screen is of Putin shirtless riding a horse. And I quote Churchill, and I say that, the very famous Russia is a mystery and enigma, all that kind of stuff. But there is an answer, he says later, right? That the key to understanding Russia is strength. And I tell my students, you may laugh at this, but that is intended for distribution in Russia, to show he's virile, to show that he's strong, to show that he's able to do these things, right? Can you give a glimpse as to what Churchill learned in his dealings with Stalin that allowed him to have that insight at all? And maybe Roger could explain who wrote those lines for it. Did he write those?
Oh, those, I think he wrote that. I'm going to defer to Richard, and then I'll follow up.
Sure. Well, I'm sorry to sort of correct you slightly, but the answer which he gives to the question is not strength. He says the answer is the Russian national interest, which is a slightly. I mean, I'm not saying that he clearly did think that strength was an issue, but just in that particular context, I mean, what he was actually remember exactly when he said that, which was October 1939, which was just just a couple of months after the Nazi-Soviet pact. And so what he was saying there was actually making a kind of prediction of the eventual alliance which took place, that he was really saying that in due course the Soviets will be sort of driven into our arms, if you like, because they can't, this sort of peace with the Nazis really cannot last. Now, in a way, you've just sort of asked me to give the 45-minute talk which I usually give about this topic, but I'm trying to sort of really boil it down. And the sort of the key, I would say, to understanding Churchill's relationship with Stalin is that he perceived him as not a nice person, but as a rational actor who would act in the Russian national interest, in contrast to somebody like Trotsky, who he saw as a much more dangerous figure, as somebody who wanted to export global revolution. Now, Churchill knew that the Russian national interest and the British national interest were not the same thing, but there could be moments when the two would sort of coincide, as they obviously did from 1941 to 1945. And so if you think about what Churchill says then in 1946 in the Iron Curtain speech, yes, he's emphasizing strength, but what he's really emphasizing is that if you give the Russians or the Soviets the right message, if you show that you have the sufficient strength, then they are intelligent enough to react rationally to that. In other words, you can deter them because they are rational. And I guess that he also does, as we were saying, in some ways misunderstand Stalin. He does think that maybe there's a group of people in the Politburo who are sort of manipulating Stalin, or who Stalin has to take into account. But in a sense, that is, the sort of perhaps the difference between, or a difference between Stalin and Putin, is that Putin is perhaps less rational and less predictable than Stalin was. So, Churchill didn't get Stalin completely right, obviously, but that he thought it was possible to have a relationship with him. And I would sort of just concluding note that although in retrospect, for a long time, you could look back at the early years of the Cold War and say, well, this is a sort of, the Cold War is kind of a terrible disaster, and it obviously wasn't great. But in fact, you've got to give credit to sort of people on all sides for the fact that that conflict didn't actually turn into World War III. And I think that is now something we may have to kind of rethink a bit and actually give, hate to say it, gives even Stalin more credit for the fact that he, maybe Churchill was right, that Stalin was rational enough not to push his luck. He certainly, sort of pushed the envelope as much as he could. He extracted as much out of the situation as he could, but appreciated that another global conflict, was not going to do the Soviet Union any good. And so that actual restraint on both sides it would be kind of nice if Putin was showing some of that now.
Thank you.
I would just add some color to that, which is, as Richard and my dad knows, I've been working on a book about Churchill and Russia. And I've read everything that Churchill has written about Russia to look about how he discusses Russia. And I've sort of almost put this into a spreadsheet. And up to the Second World War, he uses phraseology, even not just about the Soviets, but about Russia itself as being vast. That's an adjective he uses a lot. Vast, unknowable, often comparing it to Asian warlords, because there's a part of Churchill that thinks that Russia is unknowable because it's Asian. He never sort of gets past the kind of Asian warlord idea about either Russia or the Soviets. And of course, after the First World War, when the Bolsheviks take over, his terminology becomes about crocodiles and inhuman slaughter and vipers and whatever. So he obviously uses a lot of respect to him. I think for Churchill, just to bring this to a personal level, in a way about Stalin as well, is that Stalin in Churchill's mind represented someone that kind of made sense to him because he was a rational actor. And for the first time, Churchill starts fishing for a kind of the possibility of a Soviet alliance in the diaries of the Soviet ambassador in London. We know that as early as like 33, 34.
34, I would say 34.
And so we know that Churchill's kind of open to playing the geopolitics game, the old great game, as it were, kind of just working out what the self-interest is, how can we deal with Germany as a new threat. And I think when Stalin appears and Churchill likes him, because they do genuinely get on, he sees him as someone who is rational and someone with whom he can do business. Stalin takes advantage of that, and I often like to think of Stalin as like the raptors in Jurassic Park, constantly testing the fence, trying to work out, where he can get where he can get an advantage, but fundamentally for his own interests and the interests of Russia. And when I say that, I do specifically mean the interest of Joseph Stalin, not necessarily the Soviet Union. So if that adds some more color to what you're saying. Are there any other questions before you guys go to lunch? Well, thank you all for attending this conference. It's been a tremendous amount of fun. I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.